China says it will no longer seek the special treatment given to developing countries in World Trade Organization agreements. It's a change welcomed by the WTO as well as the United States, which has long complained about barriers to their exports. Well, let's find out what this all means for global trade with senior lecturer in China and international politics at the University of London, Dr Yuka Kobayashi. Doctor, thank you so much for joining the show tonight. Can you tell us what is the special treatment that China is giving up?
That's a very good question because it's been on the cards for a very long time since China is very much a big player in trade. And essentially, it was actually one of the reasons why we're actually seeing the first US-China trade war, essentially because it is actually much more advanced than it was when it joined in 2001. So China's not giving up its developing country status, but what they're actually saying is that they're giving up the special and preferential treatment given to developing and least developed countries in the WTO. And there are various reasons why they're doing this. And one of the reasons why it comes at this timing is essentially to actually put a bit of a damper in kind of the tensions between China and the United States and the current tariff wars.
Well, the change affects only ongoing and future negotiations, not existing agreements. Can you give us some examples of what could be affected?
So you're absolutely right. So essentially, like for example, like the agricultural subsidies, which is actually a big issue between the US and China, that won't be affected because essentially that is something that was actually in the last round, the Uruguay round. So what's being affected is things like, for example, trades and services and the things that are currently ongoing in the Doha round negotiations. So going forward, China is actually relinquishing sort of a slower implementation rate. So developing countries have a different phase in sort of schedule to other countries. So the WTO works on the principle of how advanced and how important a country is. So developing countries have a bit of a buffer before they're actually expected to be in line with many of the negotiated instruments.
Well, China says the move is aimed at boosting the global trading system. Can you explain to us how that might be achieved overall?
That's a very interesting question. It comes at an interesting timing because at the beginning of this month, we had China unveil one of their fourth initiatives, the Global Governance Initiative, and that comes after the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative. So Xi Jinping has actually been unveiling these initiatives to really revamp the Chinese vision of a world order. And this idea about giving up their preferential treatment in the WTO was announced at the 80th meeting of the UN, where they were having a parallel session on the Global Development Initiative. So essentially, it comes at a time when liberal international order is actually being questioned. The WTO is actually crippled because they're not having an appellate body functioning. So essentially, we're having really interesting measures where China is trying to revamp what's left of the WTO, whereas we're actually seeing more unilateral measures by the other important actor, trade actor, the United States, taking things like the tariff wars. So we have a very interesting kind of competition between the visions of world order between the US and China. And I think China is very much pushing forward the WTO, which really helped China become what China is today. So one of the benefactors of the WTO was China going from when they joined in 2001 to the developing status to the developed economy that we see today.
And what do you make of the WTO's response? It says it will help make the trading system fairer and balanced. And do you think other countries might follow China's footsteps?
Ooh, that's a very difficult question. I think in terms of what's coming out of Geneva is they're actually having various measures to really reform the WTO, one being this kind of status of developing countries. But essentially, it comes at a time when China is really trying to assert and push forward the WTO, but there's a lot of disappointment of the Uruguay round, essentially because developing country round is what the Doha round was, but it's been actually very problematic, mainly because of developing countries which have become very important countries like China and India. So I think further challenges ahead while the WTO goes to its ministerial next month, but essentially we're actually actually seeing a very positive, but very late steps in terms of China really addressing their current status in the trade.
Well, China says it will still call itself a developing country. Why does Beijing want to continue identifying as such?
This comes from China's diplomacy with the global south. Essentially, where the PRC got to where it was, where it is today, is essentially because of its very strong linkages with the global south. So if you think about in 1971, the shift from the ROC to the PRC, that was possible because it was in the UN where one country had a vote. And essentially the developing countries helping the PRC regain its kind of representation in the UN. So it goes back that far. And it also goes back to Tiananmen when a lot of countries actually isolated China. China really revamped its developing country sort of connections. And it's also been really reinforced and emphasized with the Belt and Road Initiative, where they always say that we are not a developed country or a developing country. We understand the needs of a developing country, and they want to become a model for further developing countries and least developed countries to actually follow suit. And this is why they're actually having very kind of, preferential trading arrangements with least developed countries that came a couple of months ago. So essentially, China is actually playing this developing country status and emphasizing this that semi-colonial status they had, and essentially trying to bond with the developing world, which has actually been kind of the undercurrents of the Belt and Road Initiative. And there are kind of issues with basically developing countries. It's not a completely a rosy picture, a win-win solution, and you actually see pushback in several developing countries. But it has been a very important pillar in China's foreign policy, essentially because they want to emphasize that they are not the same as other hegemonic actors.
Really interesting to talk. Dr. Yuka Kobayashi, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.